I'm very, very pleased indeed to have an opportunity to come to Princeton. It's the first time that I've come to Princeton as the ambassador, although I was here in September of 2001, shortly after 9/11. In fact, I was here on the day that the current president of this great institution took up office, and I remember watching from the street this exotic ceremony that was taking place on the grounds of the university. Basically, what I would like to talk about is the relationship between, broadly, Europe and the United States, and more narrowly, the European Union and the United States. And I think I would divide my remarks into three parts. First of all, what are the differences in the context within which the relationship must be conducted? And I will identify six. Of course, there are many more than six, but I'll just talk about six of them. What's the structure of the relationship? I'll refer to that. And then I will say something about 5 challenges that we must face together that, again, I have arbitrarily selected, and I'm sure you could make a better selection yourselves. First of all, the 6 differences in context. I think, first of all, it's important to say that in the 17th century, we in Europe had a 30 years war from 1618 to 1648, and it was a war driven by religion. Religion has been the subject of warfare in Europe, and indeed the context or the excuse for conflict in Europe up to relatively recently. Also, Europe is a part of the world in which there isn't necessarily a separation of church and state. For example, until the year 2000, the Lutheran Church was the established church of Sweden. The Church of England, Episcopalian Church, is to this day the established church of of England. And the Queen of England, who also is the Queen of the United Kingdom, must be a member of the Church of England. And in Ireland, until relatively recently, there was a special position of the Catholic Church in the Constitution. And in many other countries, religion is by law established, or was by law established. France being a major exception to this since the French Revolution, where a clear separation has been made. But this explains in part, if you like, the lack of religiosity in European politics, because many Europeans feel, well, we've had more than enough of it, dating back to the 30 Years' War and all the other sort of things that have been put in place. Whereas here in this country, religion has benefited, I think, from the separation of church and state from your foundation, and that has allowed it to flower more. And this means that when we discuss political issues, very often Americans will approach it explicitly from a religious conviction, whereas we Europeans find that sort of dialogue something we just don't understand. Secondly, very quickly, you have much more land here. You have much more space than we have. We're a crowded little continent, and the population density is about 3 times as much in Europe as it is here. And that affects the way we look at the world and the way we relate to one another. We bump into one another physically much more because there's less space to avoid one another than there is. Thirdly, and very importantly, I think although the United States has been involved in many, many wars, it's not since 1865 that you've had a war on your own territory, with the exception of 1 or 2 islands off Alaska that were occupied by the Japanese. But there hasn't been a war here on your territory since 1865, whereas we in Europe have experienced 2 utterly devastating wars over our territory, total war, in both the First, Second World Wars. And that, again, has, I think, created a mindset where Europeans have less confidence in military means of resolving problems. Fourthly, There's a difference in our relative dependence on energy that we have to import. Europe doesn't have massive resources of coal, whereas the United States has almost limitless resources of coal. We have exhausted most of our resources of natural gas, and we don't have resources of oil within the European Union's territory to any significant extent. The United States, on the other hand, as I say, has coal, has a lot more gas that it hasn't fully used, and certainly has had a lot of oil, which it has used with what we would regard as tremendous profligacy. Fifthly, for reasons I can't fully explain, maybe some of you can do so, politics in Europe, in recent times at least, has become much more consensual or consensus-oriented than is politics here, which has become quite ideological. In Europe, broadly speaking, the general view is that there's one right way of doing something, but some people understand that better than others. The right supports the welfare state but believes the socialists mismanage it. The socialists believe the right doesn't really support the welfare state and therefore mismanages it. But the argument is about management and competence and who can do a better job managing the economy or managing the business of government. It's a managerial problem that is very often our managerial competence issue that is the deciding factor as to who should be in government and who should not in the mind of an electorate. Here in this country, at least in recent times, perhaps not so when I first came here in 1970, but now certainly ideology and radically different views about what should be done, not how well it should be done, divide the political class. And I also think we have somewhat different attitudes as well to terrorism and to the Soviet threat as it was and Russia as it is now. We Europeans have had the experience firsthand of terrorism in many of our countries. In Germany they had the Baader-Meinhof group, in Italy the Red Brigades, Spain has had the experience of ETA, Ireland has had the experience of the Ulster Volunteer Force and the UDA and the IRA. Nothing on the scale of 9/11, but terrorism is something that we sort of have had to get used to. Whereas in this country, the shock of 9/11 was truly traumatic in terms of its scale. And I was here in Princeton the month after it happened, and I remember how people were completely shocked by what had happened then. And I think the fact that we have had a sort of longer experience of it, I'm not saying it doesn't make us any more tolerant of terrorism, but perhaps a little bit less confident that we know the one answer to solve it, and a little bit more intent on finding not only how to repress it, but what may be its causes and how those causes might be alleviated. And then in regard to Russia, here Europeans are rather divided. I think the United States probably can see Russia more clearly than we can. Sometimes you can see things more clearly from a distance. And perhaps that's the way you can see Russia, more clearly from a distance. Whereas we're so intertwined with it. Some of our member states have a very bad history with Russia. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. All of these bloc countries have particular histories with Russia. Bulgaria, slightly different from Romania. Not all the same, but all quite tense. Germany has a different approach. Also, of course, Germany attacked Russia, as we know, in the Second World War. But Germany has a more accommodating approach to Russia for other reasons. Italy and France do well as well. So we haven't resolved in Europe, as clearly as you have resolved, on an approach to take to Russia, and it is one of the most internally dividing issues within Europe. So those are the sort of that's the context. That's my arbitrary selection of the interesting aspects of the context of the relationship. I'll now say something not very original about the structure of a relationship. How does the United States relate to Europe or the European Union? Europe and the European Union, of course, are not the same, but they're pretty similar. Well, first of all, NATO is very important because the United States and Canada are full members of NATO. And the NATO guarantees territorial integrity are taken very seriously. And until relatively recently, it was more or less seen as a one-way street, that the United States was giving and the Europeans were receiving guarantees. Now, with Afghanistan, where Europe has stepped up to assist the United States, given that it was the United States that was attacked by al-Qaeda, which had bases in Afghanistan, in a sense, the relationship was becoming a little bit more equal, that Europeans were offering something to the United States, where previously NATO had been more or less offering all in the other direction. That's significant. And the tragedy would be, if things go wrong in Afghanistan, that the attempt to make NATO more of a mutual guarantee system will have not succeeded, at least in its first attempt. NATO, of course, has the deficiency that its decisions have to be unanimous. I know it has a command structure, it has resources, it has assets, military assets, and so on, but it is very much dominated by the United States in practice. But for it to make formal decisions, it still needs to make those decisions unanimously. We found in the European Union, the more members you take in, the harder it is to get unanimity. So far, there hasn't been any great problem in that area, but it's a potential problem that should not be ignored. Now, what about the relationship between the European Union and the United States, as distinct from Europe as a whole? Well, here the relationship is actually not very formal. Unlike other parts of the world with which Europe has trade agreements, legal treaties, creating partnership structures, the relationship between the European Union and the United States is an informal, pragmatic relationship without a formal structure. It has summits which take place every year between the President in office of the European Council, which was up till now a rotating president, soon will be, if the Lisbon Treaty passes, a single person over a 2.5-year period, along with the President of the Commission and the President of the United States, two presidents meeting one. For the Europeans, the EU-US summit is a big deal. It's the highlight of the year in some respects almost, because it's the big occasion for FaceTime with the occupant of the White House, or the time that the occupant of the White House comes to Europe and is seen. For the President of the United States, on the other hand, it's just another meeting. He will have had 2 or 3 other meetings with very important heads of state the same week, and will be having 2 or 3 more the following week. So it isn't exactly, in terms of the emotional input to the meeting or the personal consequence that people put into the meeting, quite as equally important for both sides. And it is accompanied by a number of dialogues and systems of cooperation. We have a Transatlantic Economic Council, which deals with regulatory issues, and its next meeting, which will take place in November, I think will also look at the economic crisis as well. And we have a Transatlantic Energy Council that's about to be established. We have a dialogue between financial regulators, including the SEC, which is sort of independent of the politics of the politicians because of the nature of the relationship of the SEC to Congress. And then, of course, we conduct our relationship with the United States in global contexts, the G8 and the G20. And I think the G20 is one of the good things that's come out of the crisis, the fact that we now have 90% of the world's economy represented by people coming around the table on a regular basis who have, I think, been surprisingly successful in coordinating the response to the crisis, in reaching agreements on the supervision of financial institutions, in reaching agreements on economic stimulus. And they are, if you like, an overriding board of directors that's sending general instructions, at least, to the plethora of global organizations that we already have, like the WTO, like the IMF, like the World Bank, the ILO, which hitherto were going their individual ways in various silos, but without anybody sort of taking an overall view of what should be done. And I think the G20 is a very good innovation. From a European point of view, it's a complicating factor, though, because only some European countries are there. I think about 7 of our 27 members are members of the G20. Now, the European Commission has a status in the G20 of itself, so in that way the remaining 20 are represented. There is a risk that the G20 could take over for the European Union some of the role of making the sort of broad policy directions that the European Council currently does. Why would the heads of state of the 7 countries who are in the G20 want to necessarily, in every case, consult the smaller members if they can go to the G20 and get a decision there, which they then come back to the rest and say, well, this is what you have to do because it has been agreed with the Americans, it's agreed with everybody else. There is going to be that temptation for the bigger countries who are in the G20 to use the G20 as a way of getting around or circumventing or overriding EU structures, which for us could be problematic. It hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it won't happen, but there is a risk to internal European cohesion from that. I now want to move to the challenges, and I'll itemise them in case I run out of time and I don't get to deal with all of them properly. First of all, I'd like to refer to our relationship with the Muslim world. Secondly, I'd like to refer to our relationship with Russia. Thirdly, I'd like to refer to our common approach, or the lack of it, to protectionism and distortions of cross-border, distortions of investment decision-making. Fourthly, I'd like to refer to climate change. And fifthly, to sustaining the democratic legitimacy of open markets, to sustaining the democratic legitimacy of globalization. Quickly, as far as the Muslim world is concerned, I think there are concerns in Europe as to whether the United States is really serious about a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine question. If the United States continues to give very large amounts of aid to Israel, Israel is the largest per capita recipient of foreign aid from the United States, and it's far from being the poorest country that's aided by the United States. It's one of the richest and yet one of the most generously supported. So the United States has many means of stopping settlement activity in the area that might become a Palestinian state. It has had many means of stopping that for years, and it hasn't used them, and it isn't proposing to use them at this stage. We've seen a dialogue between the President and the Israelis about stopping the settlements, and the Israelis are basically just disregarding the wishes of the President of the United States on the subject. Now, a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine question requires that there be territory for the other state, for the Palestinian state. But if that state, that territory is already occupied by Israeli settlements, in fact, a two-state solution becomes impossible. And I ask you, do you really believe that there will ever be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza? Do you think it's possible for an Israeli government, having been allowed to put those settlements in place, to withdraw them? Do you think they can actually have the physical means and political means to withdraw those settlers? And if they don't, how can there be a Palestinian state? And if there isn't to be a Palestinian state, what democratic rights would the Palestinians have? Would they be entitled to vote in Israeli elections? I know we've had in this country issues about people living in the territory of the United States but not getting voting rights. The Civil Rights Campaign was all about voting rights. It could become quite problematic if the two-state solution becomes impossible and the issue then becomes one of Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza saying, well, we're actually under Israeli control, so give us a vote, please. That would change, of course, everything as far as the Jewish character of Israel would be concerned. And it seems to me that this issue hasn't been fully thought through. We're dealing with the symptoms, we're dealing with the surface, we're not dealing with the likely endgame as far as that issue is concerned. That issue influences the way the Muslim world perceives both Europeans and Americans. I don't think that people in the Muslim world really make that many distinctions between Americans and Europeans. They say, well, the Americans may be the big supporters of Israel now, but the Balfour Declaration was a declaration of a British Foreign Secretary. Israel was armed primarily by France before 1967, not by the United States. I think they see Europeans or Americans as almost interchangeable. And I think if they feel that they haven't been and are not going to be treated fairly and respectfully by Euro-Americans, we're all going to have problems. I think we Europeans sometimes think that we're different and that we're going to be seen differently to Americans on this. But people in that part of the world have longer memories, and they can see that, in fact, it only depends on who's in power, who's the one that they have the problem with. At the moment, the United States is the more powerful force, but when Europe was more powerful, it was also interfering in their part of the world and dividing up the territories, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all of that sort of thing. So I think we've got to think very hard about this issue. We've got to think that this is going to impact on the prospects of a settlement with Iran. At the moment, the only nuclear power in the Middle East is Israel, unless you include Pakistan in the Middle East or Russia in the Middle East. It seems to me that any solution of the nuclear issue with Iran doesn't only have to require the cooperation of China and Russia and others in sanctions, it also has to involve the cooperation of Israel, which isn't a part of the IEA because it hasn't joined the IEA, but it's part of the world and it's part of that region. And to simply say, well, because you haven't joined the IAEA, you don't have to do anything about the obligations of the IAEA, but we're prepared to sanction another country which is a member of the IAEA to the point of even going to war with them because they're not complying, sort of is asymmetrical, to put it mildly. So it seems to me that the question of Israeli nuclear weapons will have to be part of the equation, along with Pakistani nuclear weapons and Indian nuclear weapons, and also the failure of the existing nuclear powers to reduce their stocks of nuclear weapons, which they were obliged to do at the time that others agreed that they wouldn't seek to acquire nuclear weapons. There were two sets of obligations, one placed on the non-nuclear, the other placed on the nuclear powers. And the non-nuclear powers are the ones that we're focusing on. Very little focus is being put on the decision that was accepted by the nuclear powers to reduce their stockpiles. The next issue, I suppose, one has to refer to is the relationship with Turkey. And here again, I think it shows how this illustrates as well how I think Europeans and Americans are not seen in that part of the world as all that different. Because there's been a big increase in anti-American sentiment in Turkey. And America hasn't done anything really to annoy Turkey much. But the Europeans have, by, as they see it, going very slow on the EU application of Turkey, and some countries saying they will insist on a referendum, which effectively would stop it happening. And not only has that turned Turks against the European Union, but it also seems to have contributed to an increase in Turkish negative feeling about the United States. So what I think this suggests to me is that if either one of us does something that's aggravating, we'll both suffer from it in this part of the world, because they don't distinguish between us as much as we distinguish between us ourselves. The next item, a challenge I want to refer briefly to, is our relationship with Russia. I think it's important for all of us to understand that while the Yeltsin years were a flowering of Russian democracy as seen from the outside, as seen in Russia, they were a period of dramatically declining living standards, of loss of influence, and of demoralization. So Russians don't look back on those years with the same rosy view that we look on them. And I think that, therefore, they're more tolerant of the authoritarian tendencies that are clearly evident in Russia at the moment than we believe they should be, because the freedom that we saw as great in the Yeltsin years wasn't so great for them. And I think we've just got to have to understand this. It's not going to be something that we can do very much about, but it's something we've got to understand. I think we've got to be quite firm with Russia, and I think the European Union has got to be quite firm with Russia in defending all our members. Now, that may mean that we have to be a bit slow in taking in new members. Georgia would like to join the European Union, the Ukraine would like to join the European Union, other countries would like to join the European Union in which Russia has, say, a special interest. And we might like to take them in, but if we're going to be quite tough with the Russians on defending anyone who is already in the European Union, we've got to be prudent about how widely we spread our resources in terms of new people we should take in. And I think we've also got to work much harder internally in Europe in getting a common energy policy, common solidarity in terms of any attempted energy blackmail, and a willingness not to be making separate deals with the Russians on energy that are inimical to the interests of other EU member states, which is something that I think has tended to happen at times. I won't be any more specific. I won't refer to any jobs for former chancellors or anything like that. I can see a very well-informed audience here. Thirdly, I want to refer briefly to protectionism and the distortion of cross-border investment, or cross-Atlantic investment. This is my job, really. This is what I spend most of my time doing in Washington. The other stuff I leave to other more important people. But this is what I do. Buy America is not a good thing. Means that American consumers are having to pay more for things through their governments than they should by restricting the number of people who can tender for supplies. Agricultural protectionism. US farmers are receiving much more protection per head than European farmers are receiving. We have 13 million farmers, you have about 2 million. You're spending almost as much on agricultural protection as we are. Of course, the Common Agricultural Policy has a bad name, but in fact it's being reformed, whereas US agricultural policy is becoming more socialist in its interference in the market. We also have other issues that are difficult. For example, the requirement that all containers heading for the United States have to be scanned for the possibility that there could be weapons contained in the container. This will require, if it were to be implemented, a huge expenditure in European ports, and it has been put on the statute book and is something we hope will not be put into effect. And then there are other sort of issues that we need to work, that we can work on consensually, like how to deal with the economic crisis and so forth, and hedge funds and all that, which I've already referred to briefly, and I won't need to say any more about it. The fourth issue I want to refer to as a challenge is climate change. Here, I think we are a little bit impatient in Europe with the pace at which your legislature is dealing with this problem. There is a deadline, and the deadline is December in Copenhagen. And if the United States can't allow its president or whoever is going to represent it in Copenhagen to go there with legislation which shows that the US is putting absolute limits on its greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to be next to impossible to get the Chinese or the Indians or the other countries that are likely to be increasing their emissions to agree to put some limitations on the rate of increase in their emissions. And I think the United States has to lead not by prescription, but by example on climate change. And I know that it is difficult for the Senate to deal with healthcare and climate change at the same time. But there is an international deadline for climate change. There isn't an international deadline for healthcare reform. And the international deadline for climate change is December, the month after the next month. And it's really important that you get your act together before December. And Harry Reid said that he didn't think you'd be able to deal with it until sometime next year. Well, what on earth does Harry Reid expect the 189 delegations from the other countries to do when they come to Copenhagen? I know there's lots of things to divert people in Copenhagen, and they can sit around and talk and look out the window and have a good time for 2 weeks. But they can't reach any agreements unless the United States is prepared to exercise leadership. Now, the President is in Copenhagen today or tomorrow about the Olympics. That's good. I'm not going to express a view, of course. Madrid is in Europe. I suppose I favour Madrid, much as though I have more relatives and interests in Chicago than I have in Madrid. But if he can go to Copenhagen for the Olympics, he can go to Copenhagen for climate change. And I think the Senate must put him in a position to do that. And that's what I'm hoping the Senate will do. Finally, and in conclusion, you might say, I can hear the sighs of relief already, this issue of the democratic legitimacy of globalization. I think there is a real problem that increasingly, as the world becomes globalized, the role of legislatures, the democratically elected legislatures of member states, is to rubber stamp agreements that have been diplomatically negotiated in multilateral negotiations between member governments. And the more law that's made above the level of the state, the less democracy there is involved in that lawmaking. And I think what we've got to try to do is to find ways of having democracy above the level of the member state as well as at the level of the member state. And I think the European Union has the beginnings of an answer to that dilemma, in the sense that we're the only multinational democracy in the world. The European Union is the only international organisation of sovereign states that has a directly elected parliament that is a co-legislator in making EU laws. There's no parliament of the North American Free Trade Area. There's no parliament that is a co-equal legislator in any other international organisation, in the WTO, in the United Nations and all that. They're all diplomatic, not democratic organisations in their internal processes. And I think it's important that we work together on trying to improve the legitimacy of globalisation by improving the quality of supranational democracy. And I think the European Union is giving a lead on that. It's a problem that has been identified by people like Joe Nye in some of his work in Harvard, if I can mention that place. And I think it's something that I'd like to see more work done on here and by others who are interested in these issues, in having a world that is stable because people accept that it's legitimate in the way it is managed. Thank you. Okay.
So there are two microphones here, and you can step down to the microphones. That way what you say will be captured for the video.
Oh, my God. I'm going to be sacked.
Well, first of all, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Oh, my name is Sophie Meunier. I'm the co-director of the European Union program here at the Woodrow School. Your talk was very interesting, and I noticed you mentioned a lot of countries. You talked about Turkey, you talked about Israel, you talked about so many others, but there's one country you have not mentioned at all, and that's China. And I was wondering to what extent you understand the rising power of China to be impacting the transatlantic relation.
Well, indeed, as I said, I wasn't going to be able to cover all the issues that I could cover, and that's one of them I certainly didn't cover at all. Yes, China is now reaching a point where its GDP is close to that of the United States in absolute terms. China has a significant naval and military force. China has not many territorial ambitions, but those that it holds very intensely, such as its maintenance of its position in Tibet and obviously Taiwan. So the relationship with China is very, very important for both of us. We in the European Union have an arms embargo on China since Tiananmen. We were hoping to lift that, but the United States urged us not to, and we haven't done so. We believe that we can't change China. The Chinese people must change China themselves to bring it in a more rule of law direction. I think that the accession of China to the WTO is an important mechanism, not just for opening China to trade, but for opening China to the application of independent rulemaking by people who are not part of the party or the government. In other words, that there's an objective, that there's the rule of law, essentially, in China. I think the WTO should be seen as a means of introducing the rule of law through commerce to have it extend more widely than it does. China has the worry one would have is that if China does get into economic difficulty, because if it is overstimulating its economy, borrowing too much, and it has to rein back some of the economic expansion that it has undertaken, or if there is internal instability because too many people who've come to the cities have to go back to their villages and take a big fall in living standard, and that leads to internal tension in China. One way in which the Chinese leadership might want to sort of obviate that pressure would be to become more nationalistic. We saw that in demonstrations against Japan, for example, in the past, and we could see it in other fields. I think it's very important that we maintain a close relationship with China. I think China, we have found the European Union is very willing to work with the European Union. It's, if you like, it's not Eurosceptic. China is pro-EU in the sense that it doesn't want to have to divide and conquer within Europe. It doesn't want to have the bother of dealing with 27 different countries in Europe. It's much happier to deal with Europe as a unit, somewhat different to the Russian attitude to the European Union, who are quite happy to do a bit of divide and conquer within the EU. And I think we must have a respectful but wary relationship with China and help China to develop. It's not in our interest it is very much in our interest that China should develop economically. China, I think, will be one of the engines that will help the world's economy to recover. I think it's quite clear that the US consumer is not going to be able to carry the world economy on his or her shoulders anymore. The US consumer is increasing his and her savings rate and is going to have to do more of that. The US government, sooner or later, is going to have to stop spending, deficit spending to the extent that it's doing. And it's not going to have the resources to stimulate the rest of the economy for an unlimited period. And if you look around the world for countries that are likely to have those resources, China comes up at the top of the list, followed by other emerging market economies. So we need to keep China in the game. We don't need conflict with China. We need to encourage China to move, and the European Union has a partnership agreement with China. We have regular dialogues with them, and the relationship is not without its difficulties, but it's a well-established one.
What is it doing to the transatlantic relationship? Is it pulling the US and the EU apart, with everybody trying to get on the good side with China, trying to get a good deal?
No, I don't think so.
Or on the contrary, are they sticking together more with China on the other side, and the feeling that with respect to globalization at least, now Europe and the US are in the same boat?
Well, I mean, if the Europeans and the Americans have, I think they have at the moment, 66% of the world's GDP or something like that, and if that share falls, and it is falling and will fall, I mean, the idea that the US and the EU would, control that proportion of the world's income with only 12% of the world's population, isn't sustainable in the long run. So inevitably, as China rises, and as other parts of the world rise, the relative importance of the United States and the European Union has to fall. That's almost an arithmetical reality. So if our weight in the world is reduced, well, then the importance of our relationship is also reduced. But that's just arithmetic. It's not something. It's not politics. And we've no reason to object to the rise of China. We should not object to the rise of China, and we should not object to the rise of Brazil, and we don't object to the rise of Brazil or the rise of India or any of those other countries. And as they rise, our relative share will reduce. Both of us. Both of our relative shares will reduce, I expect. Well, that's just the way it is. And I don't think there's any reason to get excited about it. There's nothing sort of theological about the transatlantic relationship that requires that it remains the same for all time. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Michelle Margot Kaiser, and I'm a second-year master's student here. I have a question for you regarding the perception of the EU at home and also abroad, in the sense that I had the pleasure to work in Sweden this summer for the EU presidency, and although the government of Sweden was very excited, and I sense the other European countries were as well, it didn't translate to the average citizen in Sweden. Both the opening ceremony that was private, Barroso's visit for half a day, and just the sense that there were no banners, no public discussions about it. Everything seemed still private and government held. I was wondering what, underneath the Lisbon Treaty, the EU plans to do to bring the EU to the average citizen. It's not a new problem. Growing up in Luxembourg, we always felt really disjointed from EU policies, and I think it's pretty common for the average citizen to struggle to define the Council versus the Commission's work, identify white papers and laws. So I'm just wondering what the EU hopes to do with the Lisbon Treaty to bring the EU to the average citizen. Thank you.
I think the Lisbon Treaty will do something to assist in that, insofar as EU laws, once proposed by the European Commission, will first have now to go to all of the 27 national parliaments to be scrutinised before they're considered by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. That will mean a more informed public in all our member states, we hope. To the extent at least they follow what's happening in their own national parliament, they will get warning nationally of what the EU is perhaps going to legislate about 3 or 4 years hence. But I don't think that the Lisbon Treaty really tackles the problem that you have referred to. And as you may or may not know, I was a member of the convention that drafted the document, and in the convention I advocated that we have a single European election on a one-person, one-vote basis to select the President of the Commission. That every European, in addition to having a vote for their national delegation to the European Parliament, would also cast a vote for the President of the Commission. I felt that that would mean that we would actually have, for the first time, a truly European debate between personalities. Part of the problem with the debate about Lisbon is that it's a vote about a legal text. Well, you can't fall in love with a legal text. You can't hate a legal text. You can't get excited about it. You can't empathize with it or say, I don't like it in a human sense. You can say you don't like a bit of the text or something like that, but you can't. Whereas if you, I think, in politics, people identify with other people. They learn about abstract issues through people, not through reading texts. Most of us in this room can learn through text, but most of the general public relate to people. Look at the cult of celebrity, for example. So I think that if you had a debate between, would it be good that it should be José Manuel Barroso should be the president of the Commission, or Lionel Jospin, or David Cameron, or whoever, Joschka Fischer, and if you had a debate where there was, and you'd have to limit the number of candidates by some method, say to 2 or 3, that they would personalize different approaches to Europe. And through their dialogue with one another, you'd acquire a positive view of what Europe might be. The problem with having your main debate about Europe on a Lisbon Treaty is that it's first of all reduced to a yes-no question. Are you for the text or not? Which is, doesn't allow for any positivity. It's a negative sort of thing. And secondly, it's about sorts of things that if you were discussing the equivalent issue in terms about how your commune in Luxembourg was run, I mean, you wouldn't know the details of the regulations governing the mayor of Etterbeek or whatever it is and how he does his work. I mean, people are not interested in that. They're interested in whether the lights come on and the water comes through the tap and so that sort of issue, but they're not interested in the details of the actual regulation. But what we've been asking European citizens in Ireland to do is to be interested in the sort of the minutiae of the process, which is described in the Lisbon Treaty. And that's boring beyond belief for most people. Whereas, if you had a debate between people who were going to take on the job of President of the Commission, and it's not an all-powerful job, he's just one person among 27, that, I think, would make the thing come alive and would mean that the Swedes would have a view about Europe. They would have because they could identify with a person who represented Europe. Of course, I didn't get much support for that because it wasn't even properly seriously discussed because people just dismissed it. They felt it was a step too far or something like that. But I'm worried, I must say, that if we don't inject a sense of emotional interest into the European Union project, that it could founder. All that's needed for the European Union to collapse is for one government once to refuse to implement a decision of the European Court of Justice and get away with it. And that's the end. That's the EU over and complete, finished. Now, to make sure that that never happens, I think you've got to create in the hearts of every European a sense that I'm not going to let my government destroy this European Union because I have a commitment to the European Union just as much as I have a commitment to my own country. That's absent at the moment. And while we've been able to get away without having that for the last 50 years, because of the memory of the war, I think we may not find it so easy in the next 50 years. And that's why I regret that not enough has been done on that side. That's a controversial view. Not everyone agrees with it, but it's my point of view. Yes, sir.
Long walk down there. My name is Adam Lutke. I'm a visiting fellow at the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Turkey question, because isn't the future of Turkish membership or not really key to the transatlantic relationship? if we think about how much the U.S. has advocated for Turkish membership for security reasons, for energy reasons, having a secular Muslim democracy in the heart of Western institutions. Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. So imagine a scenario where Turkey's denied membership, they then possibly turn away from the West. Isn't that sort of a source of potential problems for the transatlantic relationship, perhaps?
Do you think that yourself?
Yes.
Right. Well, that illustrates the problem, really, between Europe and the United States, because we wouldn't make our relationship with the United States conditional on the United States merging with Mexico and taking the 32 states of Mexico into the United States and turning this country into a country where Spanish was an official language and where you had 164 senators rather than 100, and 64 of those came from the Mexican states. This is our business, who we take into the European Union, not yours. And you have got to respect the European Union's right to make its own decisions for the sake of its own institution. And all the factors you mentioned, they're secondary. The European Union can, and I've explained this, I think, in response to the last question, the European Union can only survive. I hope you were listening to what I said in answer to the last question, but I fear you haven't been listening. The European Union can only survive if its people have a sense of identity with the project, if they feel that this is their union. And if you spread the European Union too wide, the risk is that the people won't identify with one another. Do the Turks feel European? Do the Turks feel that they're prepared to have their own government overruled for the sake of Swedes and Irish people and French and Germans and Italians? Are they prepared to accept that? Unless they are, they don't belong in the European Union. And it doesn't matter about all the other things you mentioned. The Union will have no viability unless it has that cohesion. Now, personally, I would like to see Turkey in the European Union. Personally, I haven't put any money on it, but I think Turkey will eventually be a member of the European Union. But it will not be because America tells us to do it. It will be because, over time, Europeans will come to see the value of having Turkey in the European Union. And Turks, perhaps, will come to see that their destiny lies to the west rather than to the east. But at the moment, it's an open question as to where the Turks see their destiny. Turks have very strong relationships with people in Central Asia who have Turkic ethnic backgrounds. And they could see themselves moving in that direction too. And they're free to move in either direction they want. And they're perfectly free to use the European Union membership application as a way of modernising their own society. But they've also got to sort out their relationship with Cyprus. They can't be in occupation of part of an EU state, and they can't be in a position whereby they're saying that any ships coming bearing a Cypriot flag or who have docked in a Cypriot port may not land in a Turkish port, which is their current position. The whole notion of the European Union is freedom of movement of goods. And if the Irish said, well, we want to be in the European Union with the British, but we won't allow any ship with a Union Jack to land in Dublin, do you think that would work? I don't think it would. And that's the way it is as between Turkey and Cyprus at the moment. Now, of course, there's another side to that. The Cypriots have not done everything perfectly and with a view to solving that. They weren't terribly supportive of the Annan Plan. Well, they rejected the Annan Plan, sorry. And they haven't been all that helpful in the negotiations subsequently to put the thing back together. So I'm not saying the fault is all on Turkey's side. Far from it. And the Turkish government is an admirable government that has done a fantastic job. But that doesn't, in and of itself, entitle one to join the European Union. It's not, Union membership isn't a reward for doing what's good for you anyway. Yes.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Michael Skiles. I'm a sophomore here. Thank you again for coming. My question to you, over the last few years, we've seen an increasing degree of radicalization of certain Islamic factions within the various European states. We've seen rioting in a good portion of these Muslims even advocate for Sharia law, and in turn we've seen some European states elect more conservative leaders on perhaps of xenophobic spirit, backlash against them, even pass certain legislation against them in countries such as France. Do you see any road to reconciliation and assimilation, or do you think that this will form sort of a permanent, separate, and even hostile culture in Europe?
I think this is a very interesting question, and it's something that we're struggling with in Europe ourselves. And we have, different approaches here. The government of France has taken a view that there are certain, attributes of Frenchness which involve accepting, limitations on the overt display of religious belief in schools and in other public, in other places run by the state. And then there's another European approach which says, well, we're in favour of multiculturalism and people can do what they like, and that. I must say, while I think the multicultural approach is rational, I think the French approach is more reasonable. I actually think that that France is right, and I think Nicolas Sarkozy is right to set certain minima for civic participation. And I think it's very good to see the fact that we've had Rachid Dati and we've had other people in the French government. We now see the leader of one of the Danish political parties, who's a Muslim. We see the joint leader of the German Greens, politically in opposition. He's a Turkish origin Muslim. And I think Europe is sort of managing this problem, not perfectly, but we know how difficult race relations have been in this country over a long period, and this country is a democracy much longer than any European democracy. And you've still had problems, notwithstanding the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all that. There's problems here with this issue. I think European countries are not doing too badly on this. Not perfect, of course, and I think we have to be firm, and I think it's good that France is raising some of these issues and making us think about them. The trouble is, of course, to define what strangers coming in must do to be European, or to be Irish, or to be French, or to be Spanish. Then you have to actually write down what it means to be Spanish. Or write down and say in clear language, these are the required attributes of being French/European. We've never done that. We have a sense of it, and everybody knows what it is to be French. But ask them to write it down, a bit more difficult. So this is the thing. If you're going to impose it on others, you have to be much more explicit about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And that's where I think it's a problem. I also think that sport is the most important means of integrating people. And I think it's terrific to see so many of the football teams of European countries with people whose grandfather was not born in France, or not born in Germany, or not born in England, or whatever. And the more people rise through sport, the more they become role models for others of their community as English people or whatever. That's I think, the way forward on this.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Gavin Daly. I'm one of the few Irish students in Princeton, and I'm doing a master's I'm from Wicklow, in Delgany. And I'm doing a master's in civil engineering here. I was just wondering what would be the consequences for Ireland and Europe of a no vote tomorrow. I hope that doesn't happen, but I was just wondering why.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gavin. Talking about sport, I hope the Wicklow team has more success in the future than they've had in the past. I want to try to answer that question as best I can. As far as a yes vote is concerned, I think it won't solve the problem fully because we still have an issue as to whether the Czech president will sign the Lisbon Treaty. And I can see a scenario which he may be building up to justify his not signing it. I think the timing of this, the late timing of this appeal by the members of his party to the Supreme Court is clearly a tactical manoeuvre to facilitate him not signing. He's written a letter to the British Conservatives asking them to clarify their position on a referendum, and I fear he may be going to use that as another excuse that, oh well, I won't sign to give the British a chance to have a new government which might have a referendum. And I'm quite worried about the destructive character of such a course if he follows it. Now, he may be bluffing. He may want to build up anxiety and then relieve that anxiety by doing the right, what I would regard the right thing at the end. If Ireland were to vote no, well, it would be the end of the Lisbon Treaty anyway, that's for sure. I think that member states would, the European Union would still continue with the Nice Treaty. The Nice Treaty is not a perfect treaty, but it can enable us to do most of our daily business. In fact, enlargement has taken place under the Nice Treaty, and there's been no disasters really. But it would mean that we really wouldn't have the confidence to make any adaptations of the European Union in future, because we would have had the experience of trying to get the Lisbon Treaty through and it's failing, so that any problems that we would have in the future that needed new legal bases for dealing with them would be much more difficult to resolve because we wouldn't have the option of treaty amendments, because we'd see that, well, it's next to impossible to get a treaty amended because the Irish are liable, are always going to vote no. Now, what would that do to Ireland? I think it would create a situation of deep resentment of Ireland at very powerful levels in Europe. And there are a lot of people who say, I don't care about that. And, we know what we're like in this regard. We're full of bluff of that nature, and why should we care? But the truth of the matter is that it does matter what people think of you. The general public in France or Italy, they won't care whether Ireland votes yes or no. They won't care. But it's the people at the top who are running the show, making the decisions, those who are making investment decisions in companies, those who would want to say to themselves, well, will I invest in Ireland? And this is applied to American companies. I'd like to know that if I invest in Ireland, not only will I get the low taxes and all the other benefits that you get if you invest in Ireland, but that there's a government in Dublin that has influence in Brussels and can, if I have problems, has the influence to get those problems solved in Brussels, if that's reasonable. If Ireland votes yes, we'll have the capacity of saying yes to that question. But yes, the Irish government will have some influence. Not as much, I think, as it would have had if it had voted yes in the first place, but some influence. If Ireland votes no, I think in those circumstances, anything that Ireland asks for, the default position that everyone else will take will be no. You said no to the treaty we wanted, so sorry, we're not going to help you. Now, okay, legally we'll get all our rights, but in terms where there's any margin of sort of manoeuvre, somebody will sort of say, well, let's show them. And I don't think that's a comfortable position to place one's country in. And I think the problem is that the problem with referenda is that this is all very sophisticated and subtle stuff. It's not something that you can be put down into black and white. This will happen or that will happen. And the electorate, a lot of them, they're not into this sort of high politics. So they're likely to make mistakes. And that's why I believe in parliamentary democracy rather than referenda. I believe in electing politicians, letting them make decisions, and then if you don't like the decisions they make, throw them out. But I'm not in favour of making important decisions by referenda, because there are some issues that are too specialist, too subtle, too difficult to encompass for the general electorate to be making those decisions in that way. Yes?
Mr. Ambassador, Tamara Spitzer-Rubik in the Politics Department. I'm a senior. I wanted to thank you for being so honest and pragmatic on the Israeli-Palestinian question. I think it's refreshing. But I wanted to ask you, what realistically can we expect in terms of transatlantic cooperation on the Iranian nuclear issue, in the sense that here at home, if you go to Frisk Campus Center, there are college Democrats and Republicans today distributing a tract saying protect Israel against Iran, whereas what you seem to imply was that you need the Israeli cooperation as well as Russia and China on this issue. How much room does President Obama and his administration have in terms of changing the policy and sort of trying to get Israel to cooperate as well, and the nuclear states to reduce their
I think he can count on very high levels of European support. The French government, the German government, French government, British government, German government are all fully supportive. We'll do everything we can to support sanctions against Iran until they do what the international community wants them to do. Whether that finally works or not, I don't know. And my concern, I was expressing a personal view, but I think that all the nuclear powers in the Middle East need to be part of the solution to this. That's my personal view. But I think the European Union is not going to pursue that line. I think the line the European Union will pursue will be one of full support for the administration and for any sanctions that are needed. Whether that solves the problem or not is another question. Yes?
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Nevzat Uyanık. I'm a graduate student here, but by profession I'm a Turkish diplomat at the same time. Thank you for the honest presentation. It was very enlightening for me. My question returns to the issue related to Turkey. In Turkey, at least a considerable part of population, intelligentsia, bureaucrats, and other people have been made or have been convinced to believe that the European membership is supposed to be based on objective criteria, not feelings or emotions. But today, you talk about emotions and feelings. Please go and ask Turks how they feel themselves, Europeans or not. Turkey has been member of the Council of Europe since 1949. And Turkish application to the European communities was made almost half a century ago. And since then, I have never heard such phrases or questions whether we feel ourselves Europeans or not. And I have never heard the ex-communist countries, ex-socialist countries of the East Europe have ever been asked how did they feel themselves, European or not. And I do still want to believe that the membership should be based on some objective criteria. And I would like to also ask you your personal perception of the so-called cultural differences when it comes to Turkey's membership process. Because although it is not mentioned among the criteria, once in a while we keep hearing some European politicians, especially when they are addressing their internal audiences, while referring to those so-called cultural differences. Does it mean outright difference in religion? And how would this be reconciled with Turkey's political system as secular? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And as the last point, sorry, forgive me. For the Turkish position not allowing Greek Cypriot ships to Turkish ports, I think this is the not the whole picture you portrayed before, because there was a package, as far as I know, a bargaining, a negotiation that involves also the opening up Turkish ports to Greek Cypriots. But before that, 1 month before the Greek Cypriot admission to the Union, with the encouragement and support of the European Union, there was a referendum on both sides of the island. And Turkish side, with the support of the European Union, said yes. to the UN-sponsored unification plan. But it was the Greek side, that was Greek Cypriot side, that said no. And since then, despite the earlier promises that was made on the part of European Union, they haven't been they haven't been lived up or honored so far, as far as I know. Thank you.
Well, I think the last point you've made I would acknowledge fully, and I did say in my remarks that there were two sides to this. I just didn't go into the detail that you've gone into about the fact that the Greek, well, I did mention that the Greek Cypriots didn't vote in favour of the Annan plan, whereas the Turks did. But I still don't think that there's a justification for the maintenance of the restriction on Cypriot ships landing at Turkish ports. I don't see why that has to be maintained anyway. And it certainly goes against the free market principles of the European Union. There are objective criteria for EU membership, and these are set out in the Copenhagen criteria, which you know very well. And the Copenhagen criteria have two sets of concerns. One are the objective criteria that must be met by the applicant. But there's also criterion about the impact that the incoming of that applicant would have on the internal cohesion of the Union itself. And I think the problem that's being encountered isn't so much on the issue as to whether Turkey is compliant with the criteria. Increasingly, Turkey is compliant with the criteria, with the few exceptions that are mentioned, which can and will be resolved. The problem that I think is being faced is on the first part of the Copenhagen criteria, which is in terms of what this would do to the European Union, in terms of a country as big as Turkey coming in and the whole balance of the European Union being changed. And is the Union robust enough and ready enough yet, and I emphasise yet, for that to happen? I would say we're not ready yet. I would say if we work on it, and we've got to work on this just as much as Turkey, this is not a one-way street, we will be ready. And I think what's missing in the debate in Europe is that the Europeans are saying, well, Turkey's not doing this and Turkey has to do that. Well, we have an obligation in the European Union to make ourselves ready so that we could accommodate Turkey whenever the time comes. And one of the things that would enable us to do that would be to have the Lisbon Treaty passed. Because without the Lisbon Treaty, we are going to be a much slower and more sluggish organisation. And we need also to sort of have some of the debates that I think we need to have in Europe about Michael's question, about our relationship with people who are different to us. And that's something that we need to do. And I think the focus maybe needs to be put on what Europe is doing to make itself ready as much as on what Turkey is doing. But unfortunately, the things that Europe needs to do are much more intangible and they're much more sort of, mental, whereas the things that you have to do are legal. And that's what I think we need to work on, and I think it'll take time. But I don't think it's helpful for the United States to tell us what to do. I'm sorry. I think this is the thing we, ourselves and the Turks, have got to work this out between us. And I think maybe Turkey, if I were to offer advice, should be asking the European Union some questions. If the Copenhagen criteria are to be taken literally, then, and accept that there's two parts to them, well then, you could be asking us what we're doing to make ourselves ready to take you in as much as we, that would be useful. Okay.
I think you'll agree with me that even this brief period of time that Ambassador Bruton has given us ample evidence of the combination of intelligence, frankness, and good old-fashioned Irish political charm that has made him such a successful and admired ambassador for these 5 years in Washington. So I'd like you to join me in thanking him for coming to Princeton and sharing his views with us.